Well, welcome everybody, not only to the Renew Summit today, but today at 1:30 we're talking about the integrated planning of distribution and transmission lines and projects that tie into them here in the state of Wisconsin. And joining me, I'm the moderator. I'm Policy Director with Renew Wisconsin. My name is Andrew Kell. And joining us today, we've got Kieran Gallagher, Marcus Hawkins, and Steve By. Kieran Gallagher, as the Energy and Air Manager at Clean Wisconsin, Kieran advocates for Wisconsin's clean energy transition to mitigate climate change and reduce air pollution. She focuses on the electricity grid and transmission expansion through stakeholder engagement at the Midwest Grid Operator, known as MISO, and the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. Kieran holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she modeled how changes to energy systems affect air pollution, public health, and environmental justice. Marcus Hawkins is the Executive Director at the Organization of MISO States, known as OMS. In this role, he works closely with commissioners from the 17 state regulatory agencies within the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, as we said previously, it stands for MISO, from the footprint of the operations of MISO. Marcus oversees the coordination of efficient and informed participation in MISO stakeholder and regulatory proceedings, advises state commissions on wholesale market issues, and represents the collective interests of OMS members at both MISO and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, known as FERC. And Steve By is a Senior Energy Manager at Electric Power Engineers, specializing in distribution planning, DER integration, and electrification. He's a graduate of UW-Madison and has extensive experience in power flow modeling and DER technologies. Steve brings a holistic perspective to distribution engineering to navigate the dynamic regulatory and policy frameworks that are shaping electric utility governance. So welcome our panelists today. And you guys can, thank you. You guys can further introduce your work, et cetera. But today in general, we're going to be talking about the backdrop of the planning issue that we're talking about today. Our panelists are going to give short talks, 3 to 5 minute lightning talks, if you will, with some presentations. Then we're going to engage in dialogue on various planning issues, policy issues that we'd like to talk about, and then of course, open up to audience Q&A at the end. The only one slide that I have is the one that you see on the screen here today. This was a result of a Wisconsin zero carbon study, zero carbon by 2050, that Evolved Energy Economics did for us. And Clean Wisconsin, Renew Wisconsin participated in this study. And this is just a snapshot of what the model said, Wisconsin as a whole, what the electric resources in capacity would be by the year 2050. And I'm not going to go through all this. You see some resources at the distribution level, some resources at the transmission level, some resources in the state of Wisconsin, and some resources in other states. And the model said the most efficient way was to develop transmission lines interconnected with the states of Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois, each one that could deliver up to 6 gigawatts of transfer capability to the state of Wisconsin to be able to deliver clean energy resources from other states as well. So that's the backdrop as we talk about planning today, both at the transmission level and the distribution level, in general sense that we need to develop clean energy resources and leverage both the distribution and transmission systems in order to enable this zero carbon transition by 2050. That said, I'm going to turn it over to Kieran, and she's going to talk about issues at the transmission level, I believe, right?
Yes, and I will stay seated. The clicker. Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about why we need more transmission lines and robust transmission planning in our energy system right now. So the paradigm of how we generate and use electricity is changing for a variety of policy and market reasons. But basically, we are no longer going to be depending on large power plants that are located close to cities or close to load centers, but rather we're shifting to deploying more distributed and weather-fueled resources, wind, solar, and storage, out in our rural landscape, and need to move that energy to where the people are. But as we are undergoing this transition, right now we can barely fit any more new renewable energy projects to the existing grid. So we need to think robustly about how to have the grid of the future that will enable this energy transition that we're undergoing. So the three reasons why we need more transmission lines, and the first is decarbonization and climate change. In Wisconsin, we have Governor Evers' Executive Order 38, which has the goal of 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050. And that's because our governor understands that Wisconsin residents and businesses and farmers are experiencing the impacts of climate change already. But the second reason, as Andrew discussed already, the cheapest electricity we have is wind and solar. And in Wisconsin, it's specifically wind out west in Minnesota and Iowa, the Dakotas, just because their wind resources are stronger and blow more consistently. In that net zero study that Andrew showed the pie chart of, we found that not expanding our transmission lines would cost Wisconsin an additional $1 billion a year to achieve net zero emissions. And then the third reason is reliability. We need to build a grid that's bigger than the weather. This will help us to manage the daily and predictable fluctuations in solar and wind when the sun goes down and the wind stops blowing. But it'll also help us manage, prevent blackouts and prevent outages during these winter storms that are increasingly having impacts on our grid. Since it allows for more diverse resources to provide electricity, and a place that's not in the eye of the storm is able to import the electricity to a place that is very cold or there's a massive snowstorm happening. So Wisconsin is part of MISO, the Mid-Continent System Operator, and MISO truly is a leader in transmission planning. And I know Marcus is going to talk more about that. But in 2002, they, in this new long-term transmission planning process, they identified a portfolio of lines that they're calling Tranche 1, and it was approved in 2022. And these lines are kind of the low-hanging fruit. Like, what do we need for the near-term energy transition? It enables 85% of state and utility goals, and it mostly utilizes existing rights-of-way. So we're not, for the most part, not building new transmission lines in untouched areas. These lines are going to pay for themselves. That was a requirement that to approve this portfolio. So MISO estimates these lines are going to cost about $10 billion to construct. These lines are going to be in service for 60 to 80 years, and MISO estimated the benefits of these lines only for the first 20 years of their life, and found that they will yield 2 to nearly 4 times the amount of environmental and economic benefits. Benefits like access to that lower cost electricity out west, reducing blackouts, and so on. So these are the 3 lines that are going to be coming to Wisconsin very shortly. I know at least Project 5 and 6, constructed by ATC and Excel, are going to submit applications at the PSCW this year. And hopefully through that regulatory process and afterwards in construction, we'll see the robust transmission planning that MISO has been doing come to fruition.
All right, my mic on? Awesome. I guess I'll sit down too, just because I was joking earlier that I have 3 slides and I use them in a presentation every single week, so I know exactly what these look like and I talk about them all the time. So I guess I want to just build on what Kieran was just saying and kind of add in some of the background story of how complicated transmission planning is. And so I work with 15 state utility commissions spread throughout the MISO region, and help the commissions engage in this very complex and very important process, because at the end of the day, the commissions have to cite and approve transmission lines when utilities want to build in their state territories, and they have to protect the consumer in those states and make sure that they're actually needed and are going to be beneficial under a wide range of uncertainty. So where are these new resources going to be located? We don't really know. We have some ideas, but will this transmission line be valuable if these wind resources we assume to be located in County X are actually in County Y? So you have to do a bunch of analysis and modeling to try to understand that the transmission lines that are approved at MISO and then eventually before state commissions are going to be valuable to the customers in each of the states. And so that's a very simplified, like high-level explanation. Beyond that, you have forecasts for load growth, which is all over the place now. You have forecasts for fuel costs changing. You have all sorts of incentives that are coming and going. Federal policy and state policies are all over the place. So trying to have a sense of what a least regrets future that you're actually planning the transmission grid for is a very large and complicated undertaking. So I just want to make sure everyone has an appreciation of that. So I have some things listed here that kind of spell out how fun and complicated this is. That said, that Tranche 1 is a success story. It was the low-hanging fruit. Like working with utilities and the states that have policy goals for their new resources, we were able to paint a somewhat informed picture of the future grid and what we need to have that grid enabled. And so that was why that first $10 billion of projects was approved in, I was going to say last year, but it was in 2022, as you correctly pointed out, so a couple of years ago. And now we're looking to the future again, and the future is contemplating all sorts of new resources all over the place. And so here's a map that shows what we know now, which is the planned additions, and then the model-built additions. So because transmission lines serve load for that 50 to 60-year lifetime that Kieran was talking about, you have to make assumptions about new generation when you're modeling what that transmission grid will get you. And so you have to plug in new resources into the model to meet future load that doesn't exist yet. And you have to make informed decisions about where you're going to build those resources. And so you have a lot of variables at play, and you have to try to map out these model build additions on the left represent all different fuel types, all different sizes. It represents like 100 plus gigawatts of resources that you're putting into a model. And so when you come to a commission and you want to get a transmission line approved for make-believe resources that are 30 years from now, it's a really big lift. So you have to be very technically astute at what you're doing here, and you also have to model a bunch of different cases and prove out that a transmission line is useful in a wide range of scenarios. So this is just to kind of prove out how much you need to just assume when you're doing this type of analysis. And it's a very complicated undertaking. And you can believe that all 15 states don't agree on these types of resources, the sizes, and their locations. So there's a lot of fun fights that go on about these assumptions, and you could literally talk about it for the rest of time, but that doesn't serve anybody. So that's just me being beaten down by the process. And then lastly, because we're talking about integrated transmission and distribution planning, and I'm all about talking about DERs too. I work on Order 2222 compliance at MISO as well, and how DERs can integrate into the power grid. But in between all of this is just like the bread and butter resource planning that goes on for utilities to serve their own loads. And that is changing in a huge way. And so I just want to show here on the left is the kind of the bigger utility territories in the MISO region. They all have different planning processes. We have a lot of different states with different planning processes, states with different goals and requirements on those utilities. And there's no one person in this region that is responsible for making sure that all of these changes happen reliably. You have MISO that serves the load and delivers energy and monitors the transmission grid and maintains reliability in every 5-second interval. And then you have all of these other players that are planning for their own purposes, their own customers, their own expectations of the future. And there's me trying to talk to everybody and explain what's going on, and that's sort of helpful to them. But I just want to stress that all of these utilities have their own plans, their own regulators, their own policies that they are operating within, and trying to coordinate that so all of these changes happen in a reliable way is the work of the next 10 years, and it's really important. And so that's kind of in the middle of this integrated transmission and distribution, is just all of the resources changing right now. So I just wanted to stress that, and happy to chat about it more in a little bit. So over to you.
Excellent. Is my mic on? Okay, I'm going to use the podium actually for my presentation. So my background is in distribution planning, and I come from the utility side. I've worked for a couple of utilities in Wisconsin and Minnesota, so probably a little different perspective. T&D planning, it's kind of the theme of our discussion today. So there's a couple different problems that I'll highlight. There's definitely a lot of great things going on with transmission distribution planning, but having two segregated planning teams, what that looks like is you've assets, engineering, and strategies, and even capital allocation that are all segregated into transmission and distribution silos. So a lot of these functions, especially on the utility side, are done independently. There's not a lot of communication in between. There's a lot of regulatory pressures around efficient capital spend and utilization of those assets, but when you have low visibility into how your transmission and distribution systems interplay, that leads to an underutilized infrastructure. So for instance, you might overbuild transmission to accommodate distribution load where on the distribution side, they weren't anticipating any growth in that area, things of that nature. And subsequently, from a human resource side, you have two totally different teams. And so it's kind of you have multiple teams, and it's costly for coordination between them and those sorts of integrations, not just with communication, but also with data. And that was kind of the next point here, is data is often siloed. So distribution networks are modeled on the transmission side as essentially a constant load, and transmission networks are modeled on the distribution side as a constant source, which is not entirely how they actually operate. So you have these and then on top of it, like I said, you have customer data, AMI data that kind of rolls up on the distribution side, and SCADA information that's on the transmission side, and PMU data that is not leveraged by the distribution end of things. So you have all these disparate systems that house data that are used by these teams independently, and there's little crossover in between. What that means is there's a lack of integrated planning tools. So a lot of it relies on just purely sometimes when they have to communicate or are required to communicate. So what's the trend? Well, at least in North America, you have a number of utilities, AEP, Xcel Energy, Pacific Gas and Electric, et cetera. I'm sure there's more out there in the US that are starting to formulate integrated system planning teams. So their transmission siloed planning teams and distribution siloed teams are starting to come under one roof in a hierarchy at their utilities. This is also popping up internationally. You see it in Italy and the UK, and in the Netherlands for Europe, and then in the Asia Pacific area in Japan, the state of China, and in Australia. So the trend is moving towards more of an integrated planning approach. From an academic perspective, there's not a lot of unified modeling. So that's kind of the other piece here. So how do you plan for two different systems? Well, there's typically two different types of models. You have a distribution power flow model and a transmission power flow model. To integrate those, it's a little more complicated than just having a single unified model. There's certainly a lot of research, especially coming out of Virginia Tech, for a single unified network model that would model the generation from the bulk energy system all the way down to the distribution side. And then there's also co-simulation models. That's kind of Iowa State's area of research, and some others, where the boundary conditions, like I said, between the transmission network and the distribution network are kind of iteratively solved for. So there's a lot of research into helping develop tools that can do integrated T&D planning. So these are some of the items that would be necessary for an integrated T&D model. You'd have an integrated power flow, unified power flow across both systems, which is increasingly becoming complex. Distribution systems are traditionally radial and therefore not networked, whereas a transmission system is networked. But as we add more DERs on the distribution side, you start to have more of a networked model. So a lot of those tools aren't exactly designed to do network power flow. There's a host of other tools that need to be integrated into a T&D planning, load forecasting, for instance, operational technologies. Eventually, operations teams will be kind of integrated versus having just a transmission operations dispatch center and a DSO. And then the same for protection and coordination. That's probably where the most integration does occur. Is protection engineering is pretty good about transmission, system protection, communicating with distribution so that they can properly coordinate and mitigate outages. With that said, there's a lot of benefits that can come from integrated T&D modeling. You can improve grid planning, unified decision making, and better utilization of the system overall, and in compliance with a lot of regulations uniformly across both sides of the grid. But a lot of challenges, as I had mentioned. Just the development, the data, and the scalability of these things is going to be costly and probably take a while to adopt. So that's my portion of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. So yeah, we're going to start just to have a kind of a dialogue among the panelists now on some of these issues that they've touched on both the transmission and distribution level. And Steve hitting on the last point of the challenges. And I think about both the challenges to get to the integration of transmission and distribution planning in general, and then once you engage in the planning, what are the challenges of trying to plan for the future and navigate uncertainty and variables and disagreements and such. So with that in mind, kind of trying to lay the groundwork for Wisconsin. What's the current lay of the land for the state of Wisconsin with regards to geography, the way that the state is situated, just topography and bodies of water, how it integrates into MISO, the interconnections at the transmission and distribution level, how that may be unique within MISO, within the bulk electric grid and the Eastern Interconnect. And then finally, the regulatory model, the laws, rules, and regulations that really drive decisions here in the state of Wisconsin. So kind of want to break that up and talk about how Wisconsin is unique and what unique challenges we have here in the state. How Wisconsin is situated in bulk electric grid and MISO. How is Wisconsin unique when you're talking with other state commissions and what they're seeing, other utilities in other countries or different Western Interconnect, et cetera? How is Wisconsin uniquely situated?
Well, I'll start there because one thing that's unique about Wisconsin is that we're the only state in MISO that's fully in MISO. So we only have to deal with one regional grid operator. A lot of other states have to deal with two, and then you have to deal with processes, planning transmission in neighboring regions, which is even further complicating things. So that's one thing that's unique about Wisconsin. We are very similar to all of our neighbors in that we're a vertically integrated state. So our utilities kind of can have this view of transmission down to distribution, except for in the ATC footprint, there is independent transmission. They still work closely with the utilities. The same is true in Michigan. And so you have an independent transmission owning utility that is responsible for planning their grid, and then they serve the local utilities on that transmission system. So that is unique in Wisconsin. In Western Wisconsin, that is not the case, but in Eastern Wisconsin, that is. And so this coordination and data sharing can be complicated when you have those barriers. And so in a utility that owns transmission all the way down to distribution, those types of integrated planning that Steve was talking about can happen because everyone's in the same building. And then as far as sharing information to do the planning, it gets a little complicated because who owns the data and how are you sharing it? Is it being shared securely? And so feeding in different info streams into these planning processes is a bit of an administrative nightmare in some places. So I don't want to hate on Wisconsin too much, but I'll leave it there.
Sure. I'll talk about the geography a little bit and then the regulatory legal landscape. So Wisconsin is constrained in where we can import electricity or even generate electricity. We have a big lake on one side and another, like the UP up and the Northwoods up north. So we kind of really only have two sides of our state where we can have electricity transmission lines flow through. And our largest load center, Milwaukee, is right in the corner abutting Lake Michigan. So that adds some geographic considerations, since we have to generate a lot of electricity to serve that load. And in the past, it's been those big coal gas power plants just south of Milwaukee. There's environmental justice issues with that location. But now we need to figure out how to get solar, wind, storage, all of that electricity to that city. In terms of the regulatory legal landscape, one of the challenges is we don't have integrated resource planning, or IRP, in our state. So the plans that our utilities are sharing with MISO of this is what we are going to do are just plans that, as stakeholders, nonprofits, and our regulators don't get to consider holistically and review through a specific process. This is not a challenge, but this is an opportunity. Wisconsin has this really fantastic law called the Environmental Impact Fee Law. And so any large transmission line built in Wisconsin, 5% of that cost, of the cost of the line, goes to the hosting communities as a one-time fee. And then yearly, these hosting communities get, I think it's 0.3% of the cost of the line. And so year after year, rural communities are getting this money that is specifically earmarked for environmental projects. But if they petitioned the PSCW, they can spend it on other vital services like broadband, road repair, plow trucks. We did, at Clean Wisconsin, we did an analysis of all of these public requests through the PSC of what rural towns and communities are spending this money on. So I have a copy of that. If you want to talk to me about it afterwards, you can peruse through it. But it shows that for some of these communities, it does suck to host a transmission line, but it is putting money into their community that is going towards their parks, but also their roads. So that's a really fantastic way that we're able to benefit communities that are hosting these lines, and is pretty unique to Wisconsin.
And that reminded me of one thing that is really exciting about Wisconsin and very unique about Wisconsin. I go all over the country and talk about transmission lines, and Wisconsin is, I still believe, the only state where a preferred routing choice for a transmission line is along a transportation corridor. So you can see along the Beltline, we have a transmission line sited there. Most other states, their DOTs would not allow that, not in 100 years. They don't want electrical infrastructure and highway infrastructure in the same right-of-way. Here in Wisconsin, we have half of the transmission lines required right-of-way is already cleared by the DOT, and you don't have to take any other land. And so other states all over the country are looking at that, and this was a bill passed like in the 90s here in Wisconsin, and it's now a model, and people are talking about this all over. Minnesota is trying to adopt it, and other states are trying to catch up. And so I learned that in a different state about my home state, and I was very excited to hear that, and because it makes a lot of sense. If you're going to be putting new electric infrastructure along straight lines that are connecting cities, guess what else already does that? And it's the interstates. So it's a pretty cool thing about Wisconsin.
Yeah, and I can add, I think I definitely agree with everything that's been said. So I won't echo a lot of that, but it's not necessarily unique to Wisconsin, but we have a lot, we're a pretty rural state, and so there's a lot of cooperatives in addition to investor-owned utilities, and a lot of cooperatives or small municipalities don't necessarily have a robust engineering staff. And so when there's, especially on the distribution side, when there's community solar gardens or things like that there's a petition or an advocacy to develop those products in those regions, they're a lot of times unaccustomed to that sort of interconnection. They don't know how to handle it necessarily. It requires them to hire outside consultants, and so a lot of those rules, like PSC 119, I know they don't really apply to cooperatives, but they're harder for them to handle just because they don't have as robust of engineering staff. So that's something that's a little more unique to Wisconsin, especially like the solar profile as you move up in the state can be harder to maybe accommodate certain capacity factors that lend itself to like revenue model for a lot of solar developers. So things to consider, but definitely echo a lot of the sentiments of these other speakers.
Excellent. Well, thank you. No, I noticed, Stephen, your slides, you were showing there were some examples of utilities that had more of integrated transmission and distribution within the utility itself. I think Xcel Energy was listed, which obviously in the state of Wisconsin and in northern states in general have vertically integrated transmission and distribution utilities. But in general, that's not the case in the rest of Wisconsin. So if we want to get to a state in which we are sharing data between transmission and distribution utilities and ultimately and state of collaboration, informing each other and collaborating with each other, and resource planning, integration of clean energy resources of the future, both at the transmission and distribution level. How do we move in that direction, especially if there's no underlying law requirement to do so? What have been the discussions at MISO, at regulatory commissions, and legislature, et cetera, on this issue?
I'll go. I have one,
Sure, go for it.
one thing on that. So this data on DERs, how does it bubble up to the transmission grid, has been a problem since you and I were both employed at the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. I think we started working on this in like 2015. And there's a NERC standard that's been proposed to be changed to require transmission planners to have aggregate information on the DER that's attached to each substation. Just know how much DERs are connected to this one load substation. Because if they all trip offline because there's something going on in that substation, the grid operator needs to know if they're going to lose 10 megawatts of distributed solar. Like, it's important to have visibility into that. And they cannot get agreement on this standard just to make that information available to the grid planner that's keeping the lights on for like a third of the country. So that's how controversial this data flow question is. And everyone understands we need to have visibility into this to be able to model the transmission grid, especially as more DERs interconnect all over the place. But it's really been pushing a boulder up a hill to try to get this accomplished. So that's just one example of just how challenging this can be.
And obviously, the grid operations is one thing, but there's a wholesale market that's overlaying that too, and there used to be separation of supply and demand in the market.
Yep.
So is that one of the arguments, that the reason why we can't share, or are there other reasons?
Some of it is, well, with looking at DERs trying to participate in the wholesale market, we're right now looking at a centralized registry where commissions have to review DERs to make sure they're not participating in a retail program and a wholesale program. You can't get paid twice for your same service. And so the distribution companies have to review their interconnections to make sure it's done reliably, and that's all under state jurisdiction. And then you have to share that with the grid operator to make sure DERs are not impacting the transmission system. So right now we're looking at a pretty exciting service that basically everyone could plug into and see in a centralized way these different resources. And so that's a conversation that's ongoing right now, but there's some light at the end of that tunnel, I hope.
Yeah, I'll add to that, especially on the distribution side. There's just not a lot of telemetry to existing DER. So especially rooftop units, usually larger community solar gardens, 500 kW and above, like a utility might require some sort of telemetry or fiber back to their substation for SCADA. But on the rooftop side, especially in aggregate, you've seen this in other jurisdictions. Colorado has a lot of rooftop solar relative to community solar gardens and things like that, which makes sense given their geography. But there's almost no visibility into the capacity or amount of generation that that occurs from those units at an aggregate level. There might be from a billing perspective via an AMI meter, but in terms of rolling back into a DSO or a TSO or anything like that, there's little to no visibility. So I definitely think that, to get back to kind of your question, I think there's definitely a desire on part of a lot of utilities to have a more integrated approach or model and framework for their planning. I think there's just a lot of barriers from 100 plus years of operating a system in kind of two different ways via a transmission and distribution entities.
And just one way that this all kind of is, the planning is sort of happening inherently as well as distributed resources offset load that then impacts load data that utilities will use for their future load planning. So it's there's kind of a built-in feedback loop that makes this feasible to some extent, but from utility to utility, they might want to be planning for what if that DER trips offline? Do I have to be ready to serve that load? Is that my state's law's expectation? And so then they have to plan resources for that load, even if that load is being served by another resource, because what if that resource is offline? And so there's a lot of different rules all throughout different states and utility territories, but that's another piece of this, as well as having visibility to what degree does that load need to be served if those resources are not available.
So yeah, last question I have in relation, Kieran had mentioned we don't have an integrated resource planning process in the state of Wisconsin. Instead, we've got a strategic energy assessment planning process, and kind of a two-parter, choose both if you'd like, or one or the other. If you had a magic wand, if you want an IRP in the state of Wisconsin, what would that look like? And given the fact that we don't have an IRP, we have the SEA as it's called, how could we improve with the jurisdiction and laws as they exist in the state of Wisconsin right now?
Being looked at. So I think in order for an IRP to be really useful, it needs to take in a long enough time period, so at least 20-year planning planning period. And something that has not been discussed much in this session is energy efficiency. I'd really like to see an IRP process that robustly considers what can we achieve with investing more in our energy efficiency programs that can offset this immense load that we're going to see from electrification, but also the explosion of AI and data centers and Microsoft moving here. So those are some of the critical pieces I would want to see. Any other thoughts?
I know not to talk about IRPs in the state of Wisconsin, so
I haven't learned that lesson yet.
I have learned that lesson. So I'll play devil's advocate based on the wise words of a utility person sitting in this room that I heard one time about not having an IRP and the flexibility that that affords. Because change is happening and coming at us so quickly, if you are baked into a state process that's spelled out in the 20-page procedure document, and then Microsoft shows up the next day, well, it wasn't in our IRP, now what do we do? It's like, well, you better have some flexibility in what you're doing. And so, or if there's new tariffs placed on certain resources, like things can change really quickly. And so there's some beauty in that flexibility. And so that's one, with all of this planning, I think anywhere we can find flexibility, it's important. I work on flexibility on transmission line ratings for when it's 0 degrees like it was last week. We can really send a lot more power on transmission lines. Like, that's a great way to get flexibility out of the system, but it also applies to different processes as well. And so I think that's going to be important for distribution planning processes, transmission planning processes, resource planning processes, but utilities don't like flexible things all the time. You want to have your standards and everything. Mm-hmm. So it's a dance, I guess. I'd leave it at that.
Yeah, if I had a magic wand, how would I make things change or better? I'm not sure. I don't think I should be the arbiter of such power. But but I think.
But pretend.
But if I were king, I think, there are some state commissions that are more like, more. I guess they tend to have certain requirements from utilities, like they have to file an integrated distribution plan or an integrated transmission plan, things of that nature. That might be a good effort to start to get the ball rolling on the utility side if those, applying a little bit of regulatory pressure. I think from the utilities perspective, it looks like, well, this is just a bunch of paperwork that I now have to file every year. But I think that could be like a way to get the ball rolling, at least from the utility side. Otherwise, I think, what some states have done, I think Maine has done this, where they do essentially a statewide assessment of all their investor-owned utilities on how they're road mapping for the future, what things are they missing in their plans or in their, what elements should they start to incorporate in their plans if they want to operate within the state. I think that could be like a good way to not put all this burden on utilities to have all these reporting requirements and compliance requirements, but also it does solicit their feedback as well as other stakeholders in influencing how the commission chooses to make orders.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I want to turn to audience Q&A. I know we don't have a ton of time left. So options, we've got a hot mic in the corner of the room over here. We've also got the HOVA app. You can submit comments. Where is Ori? I think he's going to be helping me with that, maybe. So if you, there he is.
Okay. So we have a lot of audience questions. Can you speak to recabling with carbon fiber core wires as opposed to steel supported wires, and just generally the ability to transport more amps on existing right of ways?
I can talk a little bit about this because it's advanced conductoring is one of my many passion projects, and learning some of the barriers to implementing it has been heartbreaking. But a lot of what transmission owners do when they're replacing or upgrading their facilities is, look for lowest cost options, or some of that, like the existing right-of-way planning, you're gonna go up to 345 kV, and you're gonna use standardized equipment. There's less risk in new types of lines and things like that. But there are a lot of really exciting advanced conductors that are out there that are lighter and can handle more current on them, and there's a tight supply available for them, and I know it's more heavily utilized in Europe, but there are projects going on in the US that in the same right-of-way you can flow a lot more power, and it's a really exciting opportunity. And so I'll just say that I'm enthused about the possibilities, but the planning processes that actually have transmission owners recovering their costs, there could be a cost burden associated with some of those technologies, especially if they don't last as long or if they don't know how to integrate them into their existing systems. So there's some headwinds there, but it doesn't mean I'm not super excited about it.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that other than, from the distribution side, a lot of, my interaction from the utility perspective with a lot of developers is, hey, there's plenty of capacity here. Why do I have to pay for all these upgrades? And a lot of times it's a voltage constraint, which is a function of the impedance of the conductor, not so much of its load or current carrying capacity. So I think that's more of an educational disconnect. As far as the geometry associated with impedance, there's only so much you can do there. So that's why a lot of those upgrades are required.
And there's something really cool happening somewhere out by MIT, or it's in Boston or something like that. It's called VEIR, V equals IR, which is Ohm's law of resistance. And they're a startup that's doing like transmission level current on distribution size lines. And it's really, really cool stuff. It's like nitrogen cooled. I don't know, I'm not a chemist, but it's something exciting like that. So for anyone who wants to geek out about, that's like the most advanced type of line that's out there, VEIR. So
Cool. More questions, Ori?
Sure. For Steve, any examples of where T&D planning is not siloed?
Well, I don't know what everybody's doing, but I think in my experience, a lot of them are siloed. You might get some smaller utilities, especially municipalities, where they only have one engineer or two, 3 or 4 engineers on staff that do everything. So that's where I guess it's integrated in the sense that it's just the responsibilities have fallen on a select few to manage their entire system. But I think that's why you're seeing this big initiative. Like I had the graph with the world and kind of how all these integrated system planning groups are starting to merge. And it's occurring kind of at the larger utilities first. So AEP was one of the first ones, I think, to come out and say, we're going to do this. And Xcel Energy, another big name, kind of following suit. It's kind of like when a lot of utilities just develop their 2050 net neutral or net zero plans, everybody started to follow suit, kind of like a domino effect. So I think it'll get better over time, but utilities tend to take a long time, especially investor-owned large utilities take time to create these integrations. But where it's done best in the sense that it's actually executed is probably on the smaller municipal levels.
I'll just keep going here. So beyond interconnection queues, what other types of inputs does MISO use to forecast where generation resources will be sited in 20 years?
Great question. So if a state has an IRP, that can be looked at. So when MISO does a transmission study, they pull in as much information as humanly possible on what resources are expected in all of these different parts of the footprint. And so in some states, you don't have a lot of certainty of what's going to be planned and proposed in the next 5 years even. So from there, you then have to kind of look at if the state has a legal mandate for a certain fuel type or fuel preferences like Minnesota, Illinois, and Michigan do, they'll model that and make sure that the types of resources that are serving that load at least aligns with the state's laws. And so it's not in an IRP yet, maybe, but it will be eventually. And so there's a couple different data streams that can be looked at. The queue can be hard to use because it includes a lot of speculative projects that are all fighting for similar customers and similar off-takers. And so planning for the queue is not the smartest way to plan transmission. So there's other ways to get good intel.
And so MISO doesn't use the queue when they are doing their modeling for Tranche 1 and Tranche 2, but the IRPs, the plans that utilities share with MISO, and then they use capacity expansion models and then production cost models to identify where the resources are going to be located. And there are so many inputs to that are taking into account the new federal laws, as well as MISO's regulations, like what different resources are accredited at. And one of the challenges is there's some things that we've been working on at MISO that we know or are 90% sure is going to happen, but until they get FERC approval and board approval, it's not included in any of their modeling. So I'm thinking specifically of some additional transmission capacity that's going to be on the SPP and MISO seams. Those projects are moving forward, but what are not included in the current planning models that MISO is using for Tranche 2.
Thank you. Got time for maybe another question?
Sure. What impact is the Inflation Reduction Act dollars having on speeding a needed transmission network?
Speeding.
IRA impacts for
Well, I will say it led to the speeding of projects being proposed, generator projects, not transmission projects. So you can see the direct result was overwhelming the queues in every region across the country and shutting them down, basically. In MISO, we didn't have a queue cycle in 2023. PJM's queue closed for a year and a half. So the direct impact of the Inflation Reduction Act on transmission was to close the queues of the RTOs that plan to interconnect the new resources. So there's that. But it does flow into things like what Kieran was talking about. So the expectation of the economics of future resources, when you're doing those model build resources that were on my slide earlier, those models are now informed by that cost information of the IRA. So that's a law on the books. You now have an assumption that's a little more certain than it was before when the PTC was going away every other year. So that is, now an input into a model that then ends up in real transmission planning. So that's a more hopeful answer than my first one.
And it's been interesting to compare because MISO's Tranche 1 was before the IRA was passed and Tranche 2 is after. And you see that the resource mix that was the most aggressive decarbonization that MISO had identified in their first planning process now looks kind of similar to our most conservative resource mix, and a lot of that is the incentivization of renewables through those bills. So things are happening and changing, and there are some challenges with supply chain, but these are the cheapest energy possible, and we are seeing utilities and developers responding to that.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure about the IRA, but I know a lot of GRIP funding has really helped a lot of utilities, mostly the larger ones, get funding for kind of larger scale utility projects. I forget what it stands for, grid resilience,
Innovation
and something
key.
Program. So it's from the DOE. So that's probably helped infrastructure get rebuilt maybe more so than the IRAs.
And that program actually, the largest award in that program was for a set of transmission lines in western MISO, eastern SPP, that are going to enable 28 gigawatts of renewables in the middle of the wind belt. So that was a really exciting project that the states were involved in, and I think $464 million was awarded to that portfolio of $1.5 billion of transmission. So about a third of it will be covered from that program, and it's big dollars and big gigawatts, and it's pretty exciting.
One last question I have, kind of playing off the last question that came in from the audience, given that it describes some transmission constraints, planning constraints that happen at the bulk grid level. A lot of IRA funding will be funding distribution clean energy resources, right? What are the barriers to further transmission planning and further distribution investments here in the state of Wisconsin to get to the clean energy transition by 2050?
I have an obvious one, which is who pays for all of it. So, an upgrade needed on a distribution system, is it the last person who wants to interconnect their solar panel or have their EV that pays for that, or is it shared by all distribution customers in that territory of that utility? And so same applies for the transmission system. With these big lines, it's spread over a 7-state region, and everyone who's a load in that region pays for it. So as we look to plan more lines that are maybe based on certain pockets of development, there's going to be a fight over who pays for it. So that's going to be the barrier to further development, I think, on both the distribution side and the transmission side, is who's actually writing the check for it.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, a lot of the upfront costs for a DER to interconnect on the distribution system, a lot of times they're paying for that capital cost. They almost rarely have anything beyond like an operational expense, yet they're leveraging that system to wheel power. There are things like wheeling charges that occur on the transmission network that might be something to consider on the distribution side. I know that might prohibit some interconnections, but it is something. There's a gap there where the distribution network is being maintained, and then the costs associated with that are being socialized amongst all customers, not necessarily the people that are causing that additional operational expense.
Yeah, say socialized costs in a 15-state region, and you get a lot of eyebrows raised. So
Postage stamp, I think, was
that's
the
term.
term.
The term of art.
All right, well, I think we are past time, so how about a round of applause for our panelists?